Welcome to MSP 1337. I'm your host, Chris Johnson, a show dedicated to cybersecurity challenges, solutions, a journey together, not alone. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of MSP 1337. Today, we are talking about the interim. We had this great conversation a few weeks back where we talked about what happens if your vendor's gone, like permanently. We were doing incident response conversations around it. A lot of MSPs I know did lose some sleep over it. And I think that it really just lends itself to doing a better job of having the tabletop exercise of being able to make good decisions around if you were to have to switch vendors. But one thing we didn't talk about, and I want to say welcome to the show, Eric Hanson of Inland Productivity. I should probably have done that at the beginning, but Eric, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me, Chris.
The interim problem.
The
So
interim.
for those of you that have listened to some of the banter that have gone back and forth with Eric and I, sometimes we explore the things that maybe we shouldn't because that just causes others to have undue stress. But I think this is an important one because we left something out in that previous conversation, which brings us to today, and that is if you are in a situation where your cloud vendor's down or your on-prem vendor solution has been locked up, we can think of CDK and some others. What do you do during the interim? You're making a decision to wait it out. You're making a decision to shift to another vendor. Um, I'm not sure I can think of a really good answer to this one, Eric. Like, what do you do in the interim?
Well, first off, fly the airplane. Don't panic. Um,
Step
you
one,
know,
flat step,
there you
something
go.
like that.
There you go. Best get the thing to best glide.
Right.
Um, and yeah, I think that it is a important thought, maybe written procedure to have what happens in that interim. We've seen outages with Microsoft and other vendors. I think if you're in AWS East, you lived a lot of pain at one point.
Sure.
Where okay, well, you're down. So what do you do? Well, you're down for an hour, you're down for 2 hours. That's inconvenient. It's annoying. But is it business ending or significant downturn for a quarter or two ending? No, that's an
But even
inconvenience. The
but even the
reality is,
incon well, let's talk about the inconvenience. I've actually had this conversation before. I've used an example where I was on the internal IT side, where you were the external IT. Do you remember when a car hit a power pole and popped a few transformers, and we suddenly didn't have power in the office, and we weren't going to get power back very quickly?
yeah,
And
had
the
had a
funny
similar
question was,
connectivity problem too
right.
at
And I
one point.
remember that you and I had had this conversation with the business owners not too long before that, that revolved around generators and what we would do in the event that we had true power loss. And considering it's California, there's a lot of things that can take power away. Probably not the one that happened. That's a weird one. Who falls asleep in the middle of the day on a surface street? But I digress. Um, but what was interesting about that is after that happened, we immediately had a conversation that took action to put things in place so that that particular problem couldn't happen again. The thing that I found interesting about it though is at what point, and we don't have power back, do we continue to have people hanging out at the water cooler before we just send them home? And I think that was part of the conversation we had on a previous episode, which is like sometimes inconveniences can cause pretty catastrophic results if you continue to wait too long to do something about it. I think similarly, anything in healthcare, if you have any sort of scenario where you can't operate as normal, you have to have a plan B for the temporary, which can be temporary, might be a long, our definition of
Right.
temporary is not all equal.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, temporary. We actually had a client that had a vault fire and their temporary internet out, it melted all the fiber optic cable. Their temporary outage was months. Fortunately, they were right across the street from us. They had power back in a couple of days, but it was literally months before they got connectivity back. Um, we got completely lucky and we had a plan B for them and the hardware to do it. But it was literally pure luck that we had everything in place. But we think about these temporary outages as issues of infrastructure. You don't have an internet connection, you don't have power. Okay, well, take a CDK level problem with your hosted PSA or your hosted RMM. Now what do you do?
Well, and I think up to this point, we've always, and this isn't specific to our industry and the tools that we use. I don't care what EHR or EMR system you might use. There's always the possibility that exporting the data and trying to plug it into something else is anything but smooth and has a lot of other keyword phrases that you might use to describe it.
Well, anybody who's been through a
That's
data migration knows
right.
that.
I've even seen where there's examples of like to import data into our platform, here is the template. And you're like, well, that template doesn't match what you're looking for on the import. These aren't the same data fields. You gave me the template and you had me export a sample, example, and those columns don't match the one you want to see for import. So I've seen that too with vendors, right? It raises the question, though, it's not just about having my data or having you have to have a functioning working um, tool
Thing.
in order for
Yeah.
this to work. So it makes me raise the question of interim of if I were, as we had talked about, switching before, like if I had to go from RMM, something
A.
warrior to, yeah, to fill in the blank, to do a test, to like, and even go so far as I wonder if there are vendors that would actually be willing to have this conversation that says, we know that we're not perfect and that there isn't the possibility that someone could take us out. What if we had a path as a vendor to another vendor where we could actually have your data go into a different platform, allow you to see it, feel it, touch it, test it, and call it a day? So, like, if we're out, if we're the CDK, here's car software X that can actually facilitate you for the next 60 days. And I realized that was a very pie in the sky request. But isn't that
Yeah.
kind of what we're talking about? Like, it's not like you're going to
Well,
build something on-prem out of thin air.
no. If you have something on prem, you probably have a plan to bring that back. If it's on prem, you've probably got it on some vendor's system that can virtualize it locally. So
Right.
that maybe takes care of your problem. Although there are some of those on-prem systems that reach out to your vendor's cloud. I won't say who
Licensing not available offline.
exactly. Licensing not available, or authentication not available.
Yeah,
We've
this
seen
hurts
both of
SSO,
those.
doesn't it?
This kills SSO. Um,
And MFA and
and right.
yeah,
So I'm not necessarily advocating that on-prem or off-prem is better or worse. It's just something that you need to have thought through. But I think the current competitive landscape, to some degree, probably removes the incentive
yeah, the raise the tide for
for
all boats.
yeah. I mean, I don't think vendor A is going to want to build that plan to get to vendor B, and to
Right,
to take some lessons from the CDK mess. You had basically half of the dealerships in the country couldn't transact business for a couple of weeks.
right.
That's a
It wasn't just in
significant,
this country.
well, right. right. But in this country, it took out
Yeah.
about half of the vendors or about half of the dealerships. And what did they do? They found workarounds. I mean, they were kludgy as
Right.
hell. I know of one dealership that was, okay, yeah, we can sell you this car. Hang on, let me get in my car, drive down the street to the Mazda store that my cousin works at so I can run your credit.
Right.
And then they'd come back. And I mean, they did sell cars that way. They did handwritten contracts. They did a bunch of things. But we are in an industry that is entirely reliant on tech.
Yeah.
If you're okay, you lose your RMM. Well, that's cool if
Right.
all of your customers are local. I mean, it's not cool, but it sucks a bunch. But at
It,
least you can
it's
still
you.
go to that customer.
Yeah. If you're a luxury car dealership that specializes in getting, rare cars for someone all over the country, that's a whole different
That's a
problem.
whole different ballgame. If you are a, um, if you're a regional MSP and you don't have boots on the ground and relationships to get those boots on the ground in the places where you need the boots on the ground, because now I don't have, let's say it's the RMM. You lose the RMM, the
Right.
RMM is going to be down. There's lots of different ones. Do they meet
Sure.
my operational criteria perfectly? Probably not. But can I do the break fix and things that have to happen with another tool quickly? Yeah. You may if
It's the paper
let's
world, right? This goes back to healthcare and having to do responsive systems on a piece of paper because the EMR system's offline. Um, but I guess the question that I have is, and I had this really bad scenario go through my head that I'm going to say is more or less not likely, but to the. So I was thinking
until
like
it
if
is.
I was thinking so 365 is offline and my laptop reboots and it's prompting me to put in the key for decryption. I now have no path forward because I need
Well,
the key that's living in 365 that it's not local to where I am. Anyways, I just had
so
this
right,
weird,
right. So that's a documentation problem, right? Should you be
right, because it can
documenting
live
that key in
elsewhere.
two places, right? It can
Right,
absolutely live two places. But and we had an example of that. What, a month after, less than a month
sure,
after CDK, you had an example of that where people couldn't get to those keys
right.
because they couldn't log in, whatever it is they needed to log into to get those
So
keys.
these are all bad things that we don't want to have to deal with. So I was thinking about to the premise of this episode
All
is
right, we're
the
in the
interim.
business of bad things.
Right. So we're in this interim space, and I think you described one scenario, which is like, what's the bare minimum, regardless of what tools are going to be used, that would allow you to function when another set of tools is down? And we talked about some of this on the previous episode about, you're using TeamViewer or some other app to allow you to remote connect to an end user machine. Great. And a lot of those things are pretty low on the value add because if we're talking about things like automated patching and that kind of thing, well, now you're talking about 30 days plus have gone by and you still don't have access to this, say, RMM tool. But the internal piece, which I think kind of is how this all started, is how do I function internally if one of those systems, whether it's cloud or on-prem, goes away? What does pivot look like without sort of reinventing the whole thing? Because that's the part we talked about
That's
last time was you're just moving to another vendor. That's not necessarily a solution to the problem.
right, right. And you're treating the symptom
Right. Because,
more than
yeah, I think though, when we talk about the tool and I leave one vendor to go to the next, it it may be more than solving for a symptom, but the kicker is when they come back online, do you want to go back? Or are you going to say, I'm never going back because this happened to this vendor? And now we're back into that knee-jerk reaction space that says, this vendor was bad, so I'm moving to this vendor that hasn't had bad thing happen to them.
yet. Yeah.
Right. Well, that's why I said I left it kind of
Yeah.
hanging because yet
Right.
or not, you have no way of knowing. It may never
Right.
happen. It might happen tomorrow.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, there was a password vendor a couple of years ago that had a pretty significant problem, and it wasn't handled well. At first, it really didn't affect them up front,
No.
but
That's why I use a notebook.
as yeah, well, I mean, I got one of those. I can get you one. Let me let me order you one off Amazon. It comes all
The one that
bound.
says password manager on it.
The
It's got a
one that
little
says
locket to keep it secure.
yeah,
Yeah.
password book. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just add an asterisk onto the end of all those passwords. Leave that part out.
That's
Um,
right. I mean, I
uh,
can see that one being your break glass binder that sits in a physical storage. If
right.
your password manager is what's gone today, what gives you the ability to go change anything?
Well, right. When was the last time you printed out a list of all your customers? And I think you guys talked about that on that episode as
Yeah, we
well.
did.
When and where is that?
And how often should you print? So it's funny, we had this conversation today about vendor management and how often the vendor management should be done. And I said, one of the things that I would want to know is, um, what's the phone number if I have a problem? Does it work? And seriously,
Mm-hmm.
like, does it work? Because I've had an example given to me where they did a tabletop exercise for their cybersecurity insurance. Took 72 hours to finally get to the right department and the right person to help them finish the tabletop exercise because they had, oh, we changed phone systems and no one has called in since that change, well, that we know of, to test the to
To
test
find out that it
the
doesn't
incident.
work.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that was literally going to be the example I was going to use, the cybersecurity insurance vendor, because that's often your first stop now. You got
right.
to call them
And
before you do anything.
yeah, and we even had we actually went down the rabbit hole a little bit with this. Like, what's the responsibility matrix? Because one person's probably not managing 70 vendors by themselves. Who's the the liaison, kind of like account management, only not the vendor. It's at the MSP side. To be able to say I've taken ownership of Datto or Kaseya or whoever it is, and these are our account reps and all those details. But what about when something happens? And who's my backup in case I'm not here when something happens? Who do I go to next? And I think this kind of goes to the pivot. Like sometimes I think you could make a decision to go to another vendor and you've made a very poor decision because the communication path with the existing vendor that's having the problem might have actually already had a path in place to solve for where you're currently at right now, but they weren't on your priority list to get the phone call off to because we're back in that
Yeah.
whole my vendor screwed up. We just don't say that about Microsoft, AWS, Google, AT&T, Verizon, fill in the blank. We don't because we assume that because of how big they are, we're at their mercy
They're
anyways.
right. You're at their mercy, and they're going to get it fixed eventually, and eventually is hopefully not very long.
Right.
Um, but
This
you know,
someday and not today are not things you want to hear.
yeah, unless you're with that cloud vendor that accidentally deleted your account, and thank God you had a backup. But does
So should you have a pivot for all of your vendors? Like, how does one even weigh
I
this from a
from business perspective?
yeah, I mean, I think we could talk about risk all day long and critical and probabilities, but I don't think to what we've talked about so far, none of the things that we've talked about would have been foreseen based on, say, doing a risk assessment of the vendor.
Right. No, I agree. I agree. I don't know. I think you probably need to look at your, define what your critical vendors are. Is
The core
your
four.
okay, and what core
Because usually
four are
it's
those in your mind?
if I was as a no longer an MSP, they've changed now. I would say so. My financial package, so that would be QuickBooks or whatever it is that we're using to address billing and payroll. I would say my 365 or whatever my core communication tool is. So usually that's the one that comes to
Okay.
mind. I would have my PSA
Okay.
and then probably my RMM tool or something adjacent to what would be traditionally called an RMM.
Okay. So the
There
one
are
hole,
obviously others, but
there are, oh no, there are obviously others and many others, depending upon what your stack looks like. There could be many, many, many
like
others.
I'm probably not jumping to the sim
But
and sword tools out of the gate, but like because
no,
if I
I
don't have the
agree.
core four in
I
place,
think
they're not very
I,
useful.
I would I would argue there's core five. You got to have your backup
Okay,
tool, whatever that is, and that's a mixed
that's fair.
environment. I think so. You've got those five. You know,
Yep.
if your DNS tool goes offline, yeah, it's inconvenient, but I can fix that.
Yeah.
You know, I've got lots of paths to address that. It's the things you don't have easy paths to. You know, let's say one of the big PSA vendors just breaks, and it seems like it's not going to be fixed real quick. You probably have, you know, if unless you're hardcore, you know, die hard. This is my vendor, and this is who my vendor is always going
Yeah.
to be.
Yeah.
Um, you've at least looked at others. You have
Sure.
an idea of where you might go if it hits the fan. Um, and let's say it that entire vendor gets taken out. Okay, so I can't use my
The tool no working.
the tool no worky from my Florida company because they just got hit with a hurricane, right?
Sure.
Um, and and there was some core thing that there was, you know, one machine and it's irrecoverable. So they're going to be out for 3 weeks. Do you pick that up and move it to another tool? Do you work around it for uh, what could be an unknown period of time?
Sure.
Um, or do you go, you know, I was looking to make that change to these other guys anyway. So now you and everybody else, or many other people using that same tool, need to make a move. Does
Hmm.
vendor B or vendor C, or even a combination of vendor B and C, can they onboard that many people? Do they have,
Yeah.
does their cloud have the capacity to do it? Do they have the capacity to work through the issues that require
Well, just
conversation?
moving the data.
Well, yeah. Oh, that's just magic, isn't it? I mean, it's just
Yeah. I was
computer
going to
said. You
say,
just
backup,
type a little bit
backing
and
stuff
magic
ups.
occurs.
Yeah. I just think about, backing stuff up today is largely, a second, we don't even give it a second thought. Data moves relatively fast in most cases, or fast enough because we don't need it, right? It doesn't
Right.
matter what speed is, as long as it gets to completion at some point in time that I'm comfortable with. The other direction, though, we're never comfortable with it, right? It's never fast enough. I don't care. I can't imagine anybody saying, "Oh yeah, it was great. Like we got it back within the 15 minutes that I wanted it to." No, it might have been 45 minutes, and we're probably like, "Fingers crossed, we got it all right." The but when you start moving data long distances and they have to traverse more than just from an endpoint to the cloud, they now have to go cloud back to another endpoint at another location. Things start to get squirrely, no matter how good the vendors are. And like to your point, it raises questions though, like, okay, to your point about if I migrate, well, now we're back to that whole knee-jerk reaction. I don't care if that's the plan. It feels like unless the plan's really written out that says if we know that they've already committed to you're going to be down for more than 72 hours, and now you want to kick in this sort of IR strategy that's going to move,
Yes, your break
that's
glass.
probably a bad idea. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just think about what we do in the event of you know, a hardware outage. Is everybody's first response? I'm assuming there's BDR on site in this case. Is everybody's first response spin up the VM,
Right.
or is it all right? Let's see what this is going to take to fix. Because if this can be fixed with a part in 4 hours or 5 hours from pick your
Yeah.
favorite hardware vendor, is it worth the organizational headache of then having to repopulate all that data back?
And that kind of went back to the example I gave that you and I went through after we were restoring things. I mean, because we really weren't truly back to real operational function
For
for three
months?
weeks.
Well,
Well,
oh no,
even,
it was longer than that. There were a
I mean,
couple
there
of
were
things
other,
that were
yeah,
just
Sure.
development
I,
that, yeah, we got to start that over again now.
I was gonna say there were things that I had built that took a lot longer to bring back to life because there were so many moving parts that had been built over so many years. It couldn't just be, you know, boop and it's done. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
I
I
mean,
don't
we
think we
would be
think about those
closer to
things.
that today, I think, but still,
Sure.
you know,
Which goes back to how long, like what makes sense, what impact on business for pivoting uh, during the inconvenience window. When does inconvenience become uh, not an inconvenience anymore? And I think that was the example I gave with the power outage and some others is that we're not good at even having that conversation. Yep, time for everybody to go home, or hey, you're working from home. So if all your employees work from home, at what point when they don't have internet and power at home, do you not encourage them to say, I don't know, go somewhere else, assuming that it's not because of, you know, that's
some
not the highest
regional
priority.
disaster. Right.
Yeah. But we
Right.
see this kind of thing happen all the time. And when you talk to the organization, they often didn't really have a plan. So they just kind of accepted whatever the employee did.
Right. Well, and that goes back to planning in general for these types of outages, whether it's our organizations or customer organizations. I think very few really, really think about, okay, I can't get into this building for a week. What do we do?
Right.
I'll bet you, I mean, I would bet it's in single digits, the number of companies that truly have an executable, and I don't even want to say tested, but an executable plan to do that.
Yeah, I think that's kind of where,
And it's a different interim than where we started.
yeah. Well, I think it all comes down to one thing. I think your CDK, the scenarios there, what we saw with CrowdStrike, we've seen examples of this happen with other vendors, or just even things that aren't even tied to the vendor, but more what is impacting the MSP based on geography or any number of things. But the MSP has never really considered what does the model look like? Not when I think about switching vendors because of the situation, but thinking about what's the game plan for weathering the storm. And I think that kind of really to me is what interim means is how long can we weather this storm before we recognize we've made a really bad decision and figuring out how to weather the storm to a point that's a whole lot less than that.
Yeah, no, there's a lot to think about here that I think has been missed
Yeah. We
because
had a scenario here happen. Go ahead.
oh, I was going to say you can't think of every potential scenario.
No, I had an
That's
ISP here that they decided to not be an ISP anymore. So they sold
click.
their infrastructure. No, well, funny, they sold their infrastructure to another service provider. And basically, all of the legacy fiber that had been deployed 20 plus years ago, the new ISP really doesn't care about it. They just want the existing customers that are on, whether it's legacy or not, that are on active fiber. So any dark fiber that's legacy, they're essentially going to abandon. Well, for a place that I used to work, that's somewhat problematic because there's a lot of legal contracts around who can and can't touch this fiber in the event that strands are going to get used. Well, there's another fiber company that knows that all of this fiber exists in the ground. It's abandoned. Who has access to bring things back up? So, to the point of anybody that would have had ownership of the dark fiber, but has to use the carrier for servicing the fiber, they're now in this weird legal predicament of can't use. It's not quite the same as what we're talking about for the examples given, but can you imagine going, okay, so we're getting ready to roll out another fiber redundancy for our environment, and then you find out that you're in pivot mode because you can either go with a completely different carrier, or you can see how long can you wait, possibly get it for free. Because you already have the fiber, you just need someone to provide the service or to terminate it where you need it terminated because you
Right,
don't
right.
have the resources to do that. So it's a small cost, right? But like we're not talking about running fiber for miles
Mm-hmm.
because the fiber already exists.
Because
How
the
long
fiber
before you
already
pivot?
exists. Yeah. Yeah. All over in this distributed environment that you may have worked
Right,
in. Yeah.
right,
Yeah. Where you want to take advantage of that dark fiber.
right. I think this
Yeah.
is the same problem that you have when, as an MSP, you're making decisions because something has happened with a vendor. They're acquired. They're going through, they're talking about filing an IPO. I mean, there's so many different things that can happen with a vendor that you go, oh, we're switching vendors. What's your
Mm-hmm.
pivot window that says I am, shelter in place, ride out the storm, don't make those decisions just because of what is happening with a vendor and 15 minutes into the situation is putting you in well, I'm going to go over here where it's today safer than where
Right. The
I'm at
grass
right now.
seems to be greener on this side of the fence. The problem is that some other dude painted it green from your side of the fence.
That's right.
And you don't know it's dead
In
grass on the
fact, it's
backside.
actually a mirror just looking at your own yard,
Yeah.
which that's even
Um,
worse because you get on the other side of that mirror and you got problems.
yeah. Yeah.
Who's been watching?
Right. Well, or
Oh man.
you're making a decision to go to somebody who's, on their third round of funding and they're running out and there may not be a fourth round of funding.
Right.
Do you organizationally want to go through that pain? So how do you work through the middle?
I I think that's the kicker. So obviously today we've come up with no answers to these problems. However, the
Well,
answers may be therein.
there you go. The way you get an answer to the problem is first recognizing you have it.
Yeah, and I think the reality is we could probably do five more episodes on this topic and have very different conversations about it because I think there's really no one right answer, right? Like
No, I don't think
what
so.
we're saying is that you have to take the time, put a plan in place, call it pivot, call it shelter in place, whatever you want to call it. But to just make a decision around a vendor having an outage or a vendor having a substantial impact to their organization doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't wait a little bit before making a move. I've heard people call it, well, don't procrastinate. It's not what we're proposing either, because you actually have a plan in place and it's not procrastination because you know what that timeline, that time limit that you've placed on it actually is. Do you have a time limit? If you
Right, right.
don't, then
Here's
you're
where I got
not
to
ready
rip
for
the
this.
band-aid off.
Yeah, exactly. What's the point of no return and knowing what that is rather than preemptively just doing it because that feels right now because you're mad?
Right. Yeah, you definitely can't be making these
No.
decisions emotionally, for sure.
I think that covers it. I think for those of you listening, this
There
has
you
been
go.
an episode of MSP 1337. Thanks and have a great week.